same-sex marriage. Now you're for it. You defended President Obama's immigration policies. Now you say they're too harsh. You supported his trade deal dozens of times. You even called it the gold standard. Now, suddenly, last week, you're against it. Will you say anything to get elected?
Well, actually, I have been very consistent over the course of my entire life. I have always fought for the same values and principles.
I'm gonna do stuff that, because I'm intrigued by stuff that doesn't make it onto the news so much. So I'll pick up stuff off of RT and Al Jazeera, Press TV, that's Iranian news, socialist website, all that kind of stuff. I mean, all kinds of weird stuff that I like to study it, so I'll get you as much information as I can, because I think that it's important. I think that I know what I'm talking about because I do this, right? I study all these kind of details of and not so well followed stories. I'll try and get an angle, right? Needle and Thread by Richard Thompson. I heard that on NPR one day, and all I had was the name. I remembered the name because it was on the radio or something, and I didn't have pen or pencil or anything like that. But I heard this song, and I was just like, that's awesome. And he is an incredible guitarist and songwriter, and of course not famous, not really. And that's how it works in this capitalist system. And I would imagine he just didn't endear himself to the right people, right? I mean, who knows? This song is about, you know, fixing people. Needle and thread, needle and thread. And that's kind of what everything that progressives are about, is fixing the damage that is done by the other people, you know, that are just, I don't know, they're just bad, right? How else isn't that like the nicest way you can put it? I mean, I could say fucked up or a lot of other things, but anyway, if you want to listen to Richard Thompson with a little better sound quality, just get on YouTube and put in Richard Thompson, and if you want Needle and Thread, but all his songs are good. I've never heard a bad song out of him, and not all of his songs are great, but you know, there isn't an artist whose every song is great. If you think so, then you're deluded. I mean, there's just no such thing. Or maybe they don't let you hear anything that isn't great. I don't know. So, I'm going to talk about Ukraine because it's a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart. In my opinion, the Soviet Union has been incredibly generous. It's allowed for the breakup of its union. We call it empire. But then again, you could call the United States of America, you know, that shining, beautiful, exciting name, well, is really just an empire, right? I mean, we conquered every bit of U.S. territory. And if we were to just say, well, all you states can just kind of go your own way, but don't act in our enemy's interest, and then our enemies were to, you know, dive in and start doing everything they could to subvert our economy, and because that's what it's all about. I mean, when you talk about Ukraine, you're talking about, okay, they gave them autonomy to a certain extent. I mean, you have to understand that Ukraine and Georgia and the other countries around there that are now countries were all part of the core of the Soviet Union. There were like four or five, I think five different areas that became part of the Soviet Union, and they're more or less Russian anyway, right? I mean, the majority of the people in all of them have Russian ties, Russian family, all that kind of thing. So and this might be interesting to you.
One of the ironies of it is that both Lenin and Trotsky were in exile, one in Germany, one in the United States. Tell us about who helped them get where they were going to make sure that revolution was pulled off.
Well, let me summarize about 4 chapters into 4 minutes. Trotsky was in New York. He had no income. I summed his income for the year he was in New York. It was about $600. Yet he lived in an apartment. He had a chauffeur limousine. He had a refrigerator, which is very rare in those days. He left New York and went to Canada on his way to the revolution. He had $10,000 in gold on him. He didn't earn more than $600 in New York. He was financed out of New York. There's no question about that. The British took him off the ship in Halifax, Canada. I got the Canadian archives. They knew who he was. They knew who Trotsky was. They knew he was going to start a revolution in Russia. Instructions from London came to put Trotsky back on the boat with his party and allow them to go forward. So there is no question that Woodrow Wilson, who issued the passport for Trotsky, and the New York financiers who financed Trotsky, and the British Foreign Office allowed Trotsky to perform his part in the revolution. Now, over in Switzerland, you get Lenin, who was in exile. He went through Germany in the famous sealed train by permission and with the encouragement of the German General Staff. And yet Germany and Britain were supposed to be fighting each other. And you get them both moving these 2 key revolutions into place inside Russia. And then, of course, the rest is history. They created revolution. With no more than about 10,000 revolutionaries. They needed assistance from the West, and they got assistance from Germany, from Britain, and from the United States to continue and consolidate the revolution.
Just tell us all over again why.
Why? You won't find this in the textbooks. Why is to bring about, I suspect, a plan to control world society in which you and I won't find the freedoms to believe and think and do as we believe.
Did these power brokers actually envision at that time a one-world government that would be socialist?
Yes. The second statement I made was that they did not want the Soviet Union to develop into another free enterprise society, and that this would offset it. Aiding the revolution would offset this event. That was made as a statement in 1919. You have various books, one by Gillette, the razor blade Gillette, called The City, I think it was.
So this goes along with all the stuff that I've read, which is, I mean, not a book, but off the internet. Never had the money to just order book after book on these subjects, because you only get a tiny little bit of information out of any book anyway, you know, that's worth buying it for. But I had heard that, like, some of the Rockefellers and some of the other very powerful Americans who were also in the same families with people who were very fascist, so maybe they were even at odds, I don't know. But I heard that they did have this idea that, you know, a command economy is what a communist economy is. Okay, you don't have markets, you don't have prices going up and down, prices are all set, and if it's communist, then there's no profit. I mean, there's just enough, you use the money that's left over to refinance, right? So if you even bother to work with money, you know, obviously you have to do everything mathematically, but it doesn't necessarily have to be money. If you don't have, it could just be numbers. I mean, it could be this family gets 2 pounds of sugar a week and 5 loaves of bread and things like that, you know. But they had this grand scheme for like a world economy. Now, in their grand scheme, I don't think that meant sharing with all kinds of people and trying to take care of everybody. They've never been about that. More about control rather than about equality and the human race. But the important point is that the proof of that is that they were financing these people. I mean, everything happened and still happens in a capitalist economy. Even me as a pure communist, I have to live in a capitalist economy. And understand that basically communism is just an economic theory. It's a command economy. Command and control. You know, everything's controlled, everything's ordered in a certain way, and to be the like ultimate in every way, you know, whether it's conservatism, being able to conserve your, you know, what do you call it? I can't think of the word, but, you know, doing things in a really good way. I'll think of the word as soon as I turn this thing off. And market economies are all about, well, read a book on macroeconomics, and you'll understand that. But as it turns out, a command economy, it's almost impossible to be secretive, because in a command economy, the people of course say, well, if everything's being done on the up and up, then why don't you tell us what all the numbers are? In a, the capitalists very quickly saw that a capitalist economy, a capitalist system, worked for them in terms of being able to keep everything secret. Because everything, even if you think about, well, how would I find out how much money the Sassoons make, or how much money the people who own Kroger's or Walmart make? There's general terms, these massive numbers, right? But you really don't think of yourself as being able to comprehend what's going on, and it's because you can't. They don't want you to know, and it feels to me like they go out of their way to make it all just too big for you, because that's what they want you to feel like. They want you to feel like a little person and like they're big people, right? Isn't that right? Don't you feel that way? I think almost everybody feels like they're up against, a mountain or a fortress. There's nothing. And that's why they chose the capitalist system. They turned to the capitalist system. The capitalist system could be a non-profit system. We could turn it into a non-profit system. But, they use the capitalist system the way it is, the way they've built it and set it up, to make sure that that never happens, except for you. They don't mind if you work for free or whatever it is. And that's really what a capitalist system comes down to, right? It's getting people to work for free. If you only make enough money to pay for your little hovel and your bread and your food and to get back and forth to work, then you're really not making any money, right? And if you make a little bit more than that, then you're just making enough to stay sane, right? You'd go insane if you didn't have some kind of outlet besides work. Now, they will try and convince you that, of course, the work you're doing for them is fulfilling, but is it? Is it like producing your own song, or building your own bicycle, or whatever thrills you, right? It's not, right? And if you don't get to do that, you go kind of crazy. Unless they convince you that, yes, making cars in a car factory somewhere for them to make oodles of money and have tons of time to do anything they want. A perfect example would be, if you don't, and I'm not saying anything bad about Bill Hewlett, okay? So I'm over at his house, right? And all over the house are these things made out of wood and string, and they're beautiful. And so, I'm talking to him, and I'm saying, like, it must take an enormous amount of time. And some of them were so intricate, and so many little long pieces of wood, and then he'd take string and string, this was very concise. They formed these really, what looked like, I don't know, they're beautiful though. But anyway, if you're rich, you have time for such things, even if you're Bill Hewlett. And he was a great guy. I'm talking about, Bill Hewlett of Hewlett Packard, right? I stayed at his house in Palo Alto a couple of times. And I can tell you from knowing those people and running around in that circle of people that, and this is what's bad about capitalism, they all protect themselves, and they all have, I mean, the guy who I was friends with, who I was with when I'd go over there, his father was basically running the Philippines. His father decided who's the head of the president of the Philippines. His father worked with Philippine, like, they're like Nazis. I mean, they're like horrible. Nazis isn't even the proper word. I mean, he told me that, I mean, he knew all kinds of things. Like, they caught a guy making a bomb in a hotel room. Okay, well, in the Philippines, you don't take the guy and put him in jail and try him. No, they attached the bomb to him. And I forget whether they set him, I don't know what he did, but they blew him up with his own bomb. That's what this guy, well, look, his name is Phil. He was named after, you know, I mean, he was born in the Philippines. His father had been there since, you know, like World War II. I think he was like maybe, I don't know what he was exactly, but I know what he ended up being. Phil told me that every month on the kitchen table there'd be an envelope from the Central Intelligence Agency, and that was his check. And then all these people, like Phil's brother, the senior editor at Time Life magazine, right? Who went to visit him at these enormously, I mean, all beautiful wood offices, the walls, the everything. I mean, just, what can I tell you? It's just, it's wealth, massive wealth. And of course, Time Life was involved with the JFK assassination, and this is a Zapruder film, which we all have to wonder how it was tampered with, and all those kind of things. I mean, when you get down to it, there's just so much intrigue going on, and it's all to promote their wealth. And I hate to say it, but purposely or inadvertently, it's to keep everybody else poor. They don't want that competition. So, anyway, this is about Ukraine, and I'll get around to Ukraine. And, but you should know all these other details, because everything I say is relative, except for maybe Needle and Thread and Richard Thompson. You know, that was just something I happened to run across when I was getting ready to record this, and I thought you might like it. But as far as Ukraine goes, we meddled with Russia to bring about the, you know, fall of the government. So we basically engineered a coup that ended the Soviet Union. I remember when we lived in Beirut, my mom was reading this series of books that was all about how the Russians like surround America, and they get like bases like all through Canada and all through Mexico, just completely have this United States surrounded at some point. And this was a whole series of books, and I don't remember what they were, but I bet you could probably find them if you did a little bit of Googling. And every day of my life, well, I don't think about it every day of my life, but all through my life, I've always thought, well, wait a minute, isn't that what we're doing to them? And because I'd hear about this base and that base, and as it turned out, we had them surrounded. So the book was really about the United States, and it was just switching places. See, now this is a wiki about lists of countries with overseas bases. Well, when you look at Russia, all the bases are around their country. Even Syria's, their only Mediterranean naval base. But Tajikistan, Crimea, Vietnam. I mean, we act like Ukraine isn't part of Russia, like, oh, it's so independent. And we act like the Ukrainian government that is now in place after the coup, it was a coup. Coup. Any of you who don't understand that, you need to get it through your head. Orchestrated and seen over by Victoria Nuland, who's a Clintonista. So when we say, oh, they took over Crimea, well, their Black Sea Fleet has always been out of Crimea, and you always hear about, like in the beginning of the movie Red October, The Hunt for Red October. Where did Red October take out of? Where did it leave? Sevastopol? Gee, isn't that somewhere in... That's one of those places that you constantly hear the lamestream media claiming that, well, that's not Russia's. No, they just have... if it's not like the state of California is to America, then it's at the very least Mexico. We wouldn't want our like really, really big enemies just kind of traipsing around and taking control of the countries right around us either. We're all, the neocons anyway, are all really sensitive about anything in South America, most of Asia. You've got us in Korea and Indonesia and the Philippines, and we like to keep all the other countries friendly to us, like India, and got all of Europe. We're pretty... And then when you look at the the United Kingdom's got... But when you look at the United States, if you look at the map here, we're pretty much surrounding... And this map isn't very good because we've got bases all over the place. I know we've got bases in Korea, and obviously we've got like 20,000 troops or more in Korea. But Bulgaria, Belgium, and this is not a list of all of our bases. I don't know where they get this. There's over 100 or nearly 200 bases of one kind or another. Greece, Honduras, Israel, Italy, Kosovo. Isn't that like right near Russia? So anyway, you get my point, right? We're surrounding them, not the other way around. That's just utter nonsense. And I imagine Russia likes to take care of, even though they're not communists anymore, they still probably like to take better care of their people than we do, so they probably invest a lot more money into social services and stuff than their military as compared to us. And the reason that they do invest so much into their military is because of us. I mean, when you've got somebody playing around and aggressive all around you, that forces you to invest a lot more money in military than you would have. I mean, they were the #1 nuclear power in the world. They had more nuclear weapons than we did. I don't know exactly where we stand on that anymore. So, you know, these bases, there's just no doubt. I mean, you can't look at it the analysis is firm. And the fact is that we're screwing around. You know, we broke up. I mean, it seems obvious to me. I mean, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems obvious to me that we broke up the Soviet Union so that we could take advantage of Russia. And so these places, Ukraine and Georgia, I'm not quite sure where they fit in with these trans-Caucasian and Russian republics, but they're all in there. You know, Georgia and Ukraine are the two that I'm most interested in, because those are the ones I've heard about. I've heard about Victoria Nuland in particular, and I keep mentioning her. Let's just go ahead and
April 3, 2015. Author Henry Kamins. https://journalneal.org/2015/03/0 Victoria Nuland data in Georgia Victoria Nuland secret coup data in Georgia https://journalneal.org/2015/03/0 Victoria Nuland secret coup data in Georgia Former Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili has been saying for 6 months that he will be back in 6 months. No elections are due to be held and he can run for president again. Now, unfortunately, we might know what he meant. On February 17, Victoria Nuland, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, visited Tbilisi. She is best known for being an outspoken supporter of the coup d'etat in Kiev a year ago, which led to the violent overthrow of then-President Viktor Yanukovych and the ongoing fighting over this now nearly failed state. She appeared in Tbilisi at the same time Saakashvili officially became an advisor to Ukraine's new incumbent, Petro Poroshenko. Nuland's notoriety as a field-tested battle axe precedes her. Both she and her husband, Robert Kagan, are products of the Bush-Cheney neocon regime and are closely linked with its 1984 mindset of conducting continuous war, which was the basis of the defense strategy outlined by the Cheney Defense Department in the waning days of the Bush administration, the now notorious Project for a New American Century. Nuland and Kagan both subscribe to the old doctrine of manifest destiny which this document was based on. According to this, America must remain the undisputed leader of the world, because that is the reason for America's existence. As a diplomat she has been employed to serve America's interests, but, like many official U.S. representatives, she has taken the view that the U.S. interest is the only one. There is no such thing as a general or even broader interest, as her famous "fuck the EU" remark last year testifies. In late February Germany's Der Spiegel described her as America's riot diplomat, a sobriquet which can mean both that Nuland acts disruptively, and that she creates actual riots as on the Maidan in Ukraine. Its politics column stated that Nuland poses a threat to America's allies including Georgia and Azerbaijan, the countries she has just visited, and that while her current remit is to solve the crisis of Ukraine and its relations with Russia, in the crisis, Nuland herself has become the problem. So why was such a person visiting Georgia and Azerbaijan at the same time former U.S. favorite Saakashvili was taking up a new appointment in Ukraine to prevent him being extradited to face criminal charges in Georgia? As always, there is no coincidence about these things occurring at the same time. Too many connections. Victoria Nuland is well aware of both Georgian and Ukrainian history, and knows the players or patsies now engaged in them. Indeed, she was in Kiev during the Orange Revolution when she was U.S. ambassador to NATO, banging the drum for regime change. Georgia had already had a similar US-inspired regime change, led by Saakashvili. Now another violent regime change has occurred, but has not gone to plan. Saakashvili is being brought in to advise these new patsies. Nuland's position on Ukraine is clear. Der Spiegel described a closed-door meeting she held at the Munich Security Conference a week before, involving perhaps 24 U.S. diplomats and senators. She told them to fight against the Europeans on the issue of arming Ukraine to fight Russia, referred to the meeting between the leaders of Germany, France and Russia as Merkel's Moscow junk, and Moscow bullshit, and welcomed a senator calling German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen the defeatism minister. Nuland doesn't want an agreement between the warring parties in Ukraine, or to prevent further loss of life. The more Ukraine is in crisis, the more the U.S., or rather she as its representative, can do what it likes in the name of regulating that crisis. That, apparently, includes rehabilitating Saakashvili by making him an advisor and therefore a statesman, rather than the wanted criminal he is in the country he was president of. It is hardly surprising therefore that this open support for a man forced out of Georgia for his many crimes aroused considerable disquiet in Tbilisi during her visit. When pressed about the alleged crimes of the former president, she would only answer that Ukraine was in need of expertise and was seeking advice from those who have a proven track record in such situations. It was exactly that track record which got him kicked out of Tbilisi, so such a statement cannot be considered friendly. The U.S. Department of State claimed her visit was dedicated to discussing cooperation and regional issues and Georgia's path toward European integration and Georgia's efforts to defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. In English, this means ensuring that Georgia cooperates with the U.S. on Ukraine by threatening it with being barred from entering the EU and losing Abkhazia and South Ossetia forever if it doesn't. Open support for Saakashvili is all part of the same threat. Devil in the detail. After visiting Tbilisi, Nuland traveled to Baku to strengthen bilateral relations in trade and investment, energy diversification, security and counterterrorism and democracy and civil society, and advancing the just and lasting settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Note the similarity of language. The U.S. will help Azerbaijan, and ignore its own misdemeanors, if it supports it over Ukraine. If not, it will sign Karabakh over to Armenia, without consulting Azerbaijan. It was reported that Nuland held meetings with the NGOs allowed to operate in both countries. The vast majority of these are funded by the Soros Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which have long been CIA fronts for toppling regimes which fail to toe the American foreign policy line. See where they operate, and where the funds go, and an undeniable picture emerges. While this was going on, Saakashvili was holding meetings with his supporters via a big screen link at his presidential library in Tbilisi, the only such institution in Georgia. The number of youth-orientated NGOs regularly attend these meetings, including the Innovations and Development Foundation, the Movement for Independence and European Integration, Free Zone and the newly created Azot Zone, a Georgian-Azerbaijani venture, and the League of Young Diplomats. These are all standard errors for Keystone Saakashvili policies. Unfortunately, there are a number of governments around the world who would wish to benefit from Saakashvili's experience of running criminal networks which robbed, terrorized, tortured and murdered Georgians for so long. However, Saakashvili and several prominent members of his regime are being protected by the latest U.S. project, and walking into jobs in its government, despite not being Ukrainian or elected. It is also interesting that the U.S. is saying that the present Georgian government is deviating from the country's pro-Western course by trying to prosecute the Saakashvili gang. This is exactly what the protesters in Ukraine were alleged to be complaining about, when they were doing nothing of the sort. The implication is that Saakashvili, rather than the new government, represents the aspirations of the people. So what, are we left to imply, should be done by a caring global policeman? Too many rumors. All the ducks are in the row for another attempt at pro-Western regime change by popular uprising like the failed Orange Revolution and the faltering Chocolate War. All Saakashvili's many attempts to hold demonstrations in his favor since he left office have shown the Georgian people do not want him. But if the present Georgian government will not do what America wants in Ukraine, that is what it is going to get. Indeed, there have been persistent rumors in Georgia over the last few weeks that some regime change may be in the works. These have been openly reported in the Georgian media, as if trying to prepare the public for what others say is good for them. Another of the usual telltale signs The sudden increase in the number of overseas military advisors entering the country has been observed by sources at the Tbilisi airport. The former Georgian government people now in Ukraine have strong connections with the National Endowment for Democracy and Soros Foundation-funded NGOs. These are the people Nuland met and breathed in Georgia and Azerbaijan. She could have met other people, like the electors or independent media, but she was interested in these individuals and their network. As the State Department unwillingly acknowledged, she wasn't there to hear but to tell. Jeffrey Silverman, Veterans Today bureau chief in Tbilisi, recently said the following in an interview in a Georgian-language newspaper, Georgian and the World, a representative of a foreign intelligence service, who also represents a NATO country, at least I suspect so, suggested that Vakhtang Masaya, one of Saakashvili's former political prisoners and high-profile human rights defender, should disappeared for a while, as he had information that he was on some sort of hit list, and was among those to be killed as part of a plot to overthrow the current government. Based on strong rumors going around which, based on previous experience, are very credible, some die-hard members of the former ruling United National Movement and high-ranking members of the current government have been plotting together to stage a coup d'etat. There will be some nice ceremonies and private parties for a selection of participants, and as my contact sees it, Vakhtang Masaya will be one of the guests to be terminated. My source added, I am sorry for being so enigmatic, but this is something scalding and it's easy to get burnt with it. I wish you the best of luck and I kindly ask you not to mention the topic via email anymore. If you find documents but need clarifications, download software called Jitsi from a clean computer and let's have a chat through it. The world has gone nuts. There is an investigation going on within Georgia. I am sure you know what I am talking about, but PLZ do not add anything via email. It is encrypted, but not bulletproof. If you find the right door to knock on into Tbilisi, I think you will get all the evidence you need. Whether that information can be published or not depends on the politicians in power and how fearless is the Georgian press, he concluded. This is what the Guardian democracy does when its friends elect their own government. Time will tell whether that government caves in, or whether a popular uprising by 20 Georgians and 50 diplomats installs one which will. https://journal.org/2015/03/04/Victoria secret coup d'etat in Georgia.
She's been a fixture, and well, you call them neoliberals. I call people like the Clintons neocons. But she's been a fixture in their foreign policy, and she was, I mean, Ukraine went down under Obama, right? And probably under Hillary. So that's proof right there that when it comes to foreign policy, for sure, and we know for domestic policy too. So we know that the Clintons are always trying to work to help the corporations get away with their stuff.
The Ukraine mess that Nuland made Wednesday, July 15, 2015 by Robert Berry, Consortium News vertical line news analysis as the Ukrainian army squares off against ultra-right and neo-Nazi militias in the West and violence against ethnic Russians continues in the East. The obvious folly of the Obama administration's Ukraine policy has come into focus even for many who tried to ignore the facts, or what you might call the mess that Victoria Nuland made. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs Victoria Nuland was the mastermind behind the February 22, 2014 regime change in Ukraine, plotting the overthrow of the democratically elected government of President Viktor Yanukovych while convincing the ever-gullible U.S. mainstream media that the coup wasn't really a coup but a victory for democracy. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs Victoria Nuland, who pushed for the Ukraine coup and helped pick the post-coup leaders to sell this latest neocon-driven regime change to the American people, the ugliness of the coup makers had to be systematically airbrushed, particularly the key role of neo-Nazis and other ultra-nationalists from the right sector. For the US organized propaganda campaign to work, the coup makers had to wear white hats, not brown shirts. So, for nearly a year and a half, the West's mainstream media, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, twisted their reporting into all kinds of contortions to avoid telling their readers that the new regime in Kiev was permeated by and dependent on neo-Nazi fighters and Ukrainian ultra-nationalists who wanted a pure-blood Ukraine, without ethnic Russians. Any mention of that sordid reality was deemed Russian propaganda, and anyone who spoke this inconvenient truth was a stooge of Moscow. It wasn't until July 7 that the Times admitted the importance of the neo-Nazis and other ultra-nationalists in waging war against ethnic Russian rebels in the East. The Times also reported that these far-right forces had been joined by Islamic militants. Some of those jihadists have been called brothers of the hyper-brutal Islamic State. Though the Times sought to spin this remarkable military alliance, neo-Nazi militias and Islamic jihadists, as a positive, the reality had to be jarring for readers who had bought into the Western propaganda about noble pro-democracy forces resisting evil Russian aggression. Perhaps the Times sensed that it could no longer keep the lid on the troubling truth in Ukraine. For weeks, the right sector militias and the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion have been warning the civilian government in Kiev that they might turn on it and create a new order more to their liking. Clashes in the West then, on Saturday. Violent clashes broke out in the western Ukrainian town of Mukhachevo, allegedly over the control of cigarette smuggling routes. Right sector paramilitaries sprayed police officers with bullets from a Belt Federal machine gun, and police, backed by Ukrainian government troops, returned fire. Several deaths and multiple injuries were reported. Tensions escalated on Monday with President Petro Poroshenko ordering national security forces to disarm armed cells of political movements. Meanwhile, the right sector dispatched reinforcements to the area while other militiamen converged on the capital of Kiev. While President Poroshenko and right sector leader Dmitry Yarosh may succeed in tamping down this latest flare-up of hostilities, they may be only postponing the inevitable, a conflict between the US-backed authorities in Kiev and the neo-Nazis and other right-wing fighters who spearheaded last year's coup and have been at the front lines of the fighting against ethnic Russian rebels in the East. The Ukrainian right-wing extremists feel they have carried the heaviest burden in the war against the ethnic Russians and resent the politicians living in the relative safety and comfort of Kiev. In March, Poroshenko also fired thuggish oligarch Igor Kolomyskyi as governor of the southeastern province of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Kolomyskyi had been the primary benefactor of the right sector militias. So, as has become apparent across Europe and even in Washington, the Ukraine crisis is spinning out of control, making the State Department's preferred narrative of the conflict, that it's all Russian President Vladimir Putin's fault, harder and harder to sell. How Ukraine is supposed to pull itself out of what looks like a death spiral, a possible two-front war in the East and the West along with a crashing economy, is hard to comprehend. The European Union, confronting budgetary crises over Greece and other EU members, has little money or patience for Ukraine, its neo-Nazis and its socio-political chaos. America's neocons at the Washington Post and elsewhere still rant about the need for the Obama administration to sink more billions upon billions of dollars into post-coup Ukraine because it shares our values. But that argument, too, is collapsing as Americans see the heart of a racist nationalism beating inside Ukraine's new order. Another neocon regime change. Much of what has happened, of course, was predictable and indeed was predicted. But neocon Nuland couldn't resist the temptation to pull off a regime change that she could call her own. Her husband and arch-neocon Robert Kagan had co-founded the Project for the New American Century in 1998 around a demand for regime change in Iraq, a project that was accomplished in 2003 with President George W. Bush's invasion. As with Nuland in Ukraine, Kagan and his fellow neocons thought they could engineer an easy invasion of Iraq, oust Saddam Hussein and install some hand-picked client. In Iraq, Hamid Chalabi was to be the guy. But they failed to take into account the harsh realities of Iraq, such as the fissures between Sunnis and Shiites, exposed by the US-led invasion and occupation. In Ukraine, Nuland and her neocon and liberal interventionist friends saw the chance to poke Putin in the eye by encouraging violent protests to overthrow Russia-friendly President Yanukovych and put in place a new regime hostile to Moscow. Karl Gershman, the neocon president of the US taxpayer-funded National Endowment for Democracy, explained the plan in a post-op ed on September 26, 2013. Gershman called Ukraine the biggest prize and an important interim step toward toppling Putin, who may find himself on the losing end not just in the near abroad but within Russia itself. For her part, Nuland passed out cookies to anti-Yanukovych demonstrators at the Maidan Square, reminded Ukrainian business leaders that the U.S. had invested $5 billion in their European aspirations, declared fuck the EU for its less aggressive approach, and discussed with U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Paya who the new leaders of Ukraine should be. "It's is the guy," she said, referring to Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Nuland saw her big chance on February 28, 2014, when a mysterious sniper, apparently firing from a building controlled by the right sector, shot and killed both police and protesters, escalating the crisis. On February 21, in a desperate bid to avert more violence, Yanukovych agreed to a European guaranteed plan in which he accepted reduced powers and called for early elections so he could be voted out of office. But that wasn't enough for the anti-Yanukovych forces who, led by right sector and neo-Nazi militias, overran government buildings on February 22, forcing Yanukovych and many of his officials to flee for their lives. With armed thugs patrolling the corridors of power, the final path to regime change was clear. Instead of trying to salvage the February 21 agreement, Nuland and European officials arranged for an unconstitutional procedure to strip Yanukovych of the presidency and declared the new regime legitimate. Nuland's guy Yatsenyuk became prime minister. While Nuland and her neocon cohorts celebrated, their regime change prompted an obvious reaction from Putin, who recognized the strategic threat that this hostile new regime posed to the historic Russian naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea. On February 23, he began to take steps to protect those Russian interests. Ethnic hatreds. What the coup also did was revive long-pent antagonisms between the ethnic Ukrainians in the West, including elements that had supported Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II, and ethnic Russians in the South and East who feared the anti-Russian sentiments emanating from Kiev. First, in Crimea and then in the so-called Donbass region, these ethnic Russians, who had been Yanukovych's political base, resisted what they viewed as the illegitimate overthrow of their elected president. Both areas held referenda seeking separation from Ukraine, the move that Russia accepted in Crimea but resisted with the Donbass. However, when the Kiev regime announced an anti-terrorism operation against the Donbass and dispatched neo-Nazi and other extremist militias to be the tip of the spear, Moscow began quietly assisting the embattled ethnic Russian rebels, the move that Nuland, the Obama administration and the mainstream news media called Russian aggression. Amid the Western hysteria over Russia's supposedly imperial designs and the thorough demonizing of Putin, President Barack Obama essentially authorized the new Cold War against Russia, reflected now in new U.S. strategic planning that could cost the U.S. taxpayers trillions of dollars and risk a possible nuclear confrontation. Yet, despite the extraordinary costs and dangers, Nuland failed to appreciate the practical on-the-ground realities, much as her husband and other neocons did in Iraq. While Nuland got her hand-picked client Yatsenyuk installed and he did oversee the US-demanded neoliberal economic plan, slashing pensions, heating assistance and other social programs, the chaos that her regime change unleashed transformed Ukraine into a financial black hole. With few prospects for a clear-cut victory over the ethnic Russian resistance in the east, and with the neo-Nazi/Islamist militias increasingly restless over the stalemate, the chances to restore any meaningful sense of order in the country appear remote. Unemployment is soaring and the government is essentially bankrupt. The last best hope for some stability may have been the Minsk II agreement in February 2015, calling for a federalized system to give the Donbass more autonomy, but Nuland's Prime Minister Yatsenyuk sabotaged the deal in March by inserting a poison pill that essentially demanded that the ethnic Russian rebels first surrender. Now, the Ukraine chaos threatens to spiral even further out of control with the neo-Nazis and other right-wing militias, supplied with bounty weapons to kill ethnic Russians in the east, turning on the political leadership in Kiev. In other words, the neocons have struck again, dreaming up a regime change scheme that ignored practical realities, such as ethnic and religious fissures. Then, as the blood flowed and the suffering worsened, the neocons just sought out someone else to blame. Thus, it seems unlikely that Nuland, regarded by some in Washington as the new star in U.S. foreign policy, will be fired for her dangerous incompetence. just as most neocons who authored the Iraq disaster remain respected experts employed by major think tanks, given prized space on opposite pages, and consulted at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
And, you know, I hope you understand that this activity on behalf of our elite, our rich, led to horrible, horrible things. Where's my Facebook group? Okay, so I have had a group for a long time called Ukraine, America's Capitalist Shame. And see these pictures right here? Here, I'll click on it. Oh, well, that doesn't make it any bigger, does it? But these are pictures. They cornered these people in this building. They're fascists. The people who did the coup, who Newland was handing out cookies. That's what I heard during the riots and the protests. Protests were all just a bunch of rich people paying off thugs who they knew would do horrible things, and there was no populist movement. That was just all acting for the media, for the lamestream media. And this is what they did. I mean, they cornered their enemies in this big building downtown, and they burnt them alive. Look at them all. There were, I don't know how many 100 or 200 people, I think, burnt alive. And my group, it says this group is dedicated to justice for all those in Ukraine who have had their government taken away from them by the capitalist coup and lost their lives. And, you know, it leads to the, whenever you're talking about good and bad people, when bad people get control, it gets absurd. I mean, you don't hear about anything absurd after the Russian Revolution. You don't hear about Lenin doing anything crazy. Okay, yeah, he shut down churches because he was a Marxist. But, like here it says it says Ukraine wants to criminalize calling Russia, Russia. The Ukrainian parliament is to consider a bill which would make calling Russia, Russia a criminal offense. I mean, they just go crazy, right? Because they're nuts anyway. That's pretty funny, right? It's just a joke. I mean, anonymous, yeah, figures. The world is ours. Okay, so like, I mean, and you just get all this really nutty fascist kinds of things going on. And this is a story here. It says Ukrainian security services, so the SS, isn't that apropos, has revoked the accreditation of British Sky News journalist Kitty Logan. The SBU has annulled the accreditation of Sky News journalist Kitty Logan and is now considering borrowing her from Ukraine. The British journalist committed destructive actions aimed against Ukrainian citizens. In fact, she posted the real video from Donbass showing the uncomfortable truth about Ukraine.
Україна лишила аккредитации британскую журналистку Китти Логан. Она, по утверждению киевских властей...
Well, that's not going to do us a lot of good, is it? So... you know, Kiev fails to provide soldiers with military training, sends them to death. The Kiev government, of course, is a coup anyway. So, but they're trying to. So Russia wants, I'm sure, wants a buffer zone between them, a bunch of fascists. I mean, can you imagine if they were just right on the border with Russia? How long would it be before they caused trouble? And I'm sure, well, I mean, well, let's go to a video that I have, and you'll see what the real situation is between, I mean, they're just a bunch of fascists. They're troublemakers, you know. They want to try and take something away from Russia. So here we go. And I will have to read this to you because it's a guy, well, that's not going to do us any good. I did not do that. Here we go. Okay, it says you should understand there are no state structures behind us. Officials are afraid to even meet with us. God forbid they've seen with us volunteers. I tell you straight, it's even insulting. We wouldn't turn down such help. If the state just helped a little. So what he's talking about is okay, you always hear on the news, and it sounds very believable, that Russia invaded Ukraine. You hear it over and over and over again like it's just a fact. You know, they'll talk about Russia invaded Ukraine on such and such, and Russian troops. They'll always refer to the rebels as Russian troops, and there's just simply no basis for that. I mean, Russia's never sent in any official troops, and if they did, there's no evidence of it. And they didn't. They never did. I mean, the Ukrainian army was mostly, well, it was all Ukrainians. And the people close to Russia are all, I mean, we're just talking about really close relationships, right? Families, blood. You know, like I'm Scottish and English and Irish and whatever. And maybe something else, I don't know. I suspect. But anyway, so you've got all those people there in eastern Ukraine, and I'm sure a lot of them have fled from western Ukraine. And of course the Russians who are related to them want to help. So of course they're working in every way that they can, even though Moscow won't actually send Russian troops in. But of course the Russians, people who are closely related to the people in eastern Ukraine, now that I'm sure a lot of them fled western Ukraine, they want to help. And this really exemplifies how they do help. So and you're going to find out by watching this that everything that you see in our media is utter bullshit. So he's saying, the Russian state doesn't help at all. Matter of fact, he's complaining, right? Or hinted that it respects our work. So they don't even get respect from the Russian governments, even though this is the guy right here. Now, he may be Russian, but he's obviously has ties to Ukraine. And he's no doubt working to, they have moral beliefs, and that they should fight this. I mean, Kiev is just fascist, and I assure you that most of the people don't like, and sooner or later that government's going to go down.
Хотя бы намекнула, что она уважительно относится к нашей деятельности. Нас было бы в разы больше.
If we operated on a paid basis, we'd have purged the Ukraine right to Lviv.
То мы бы Украину до самого Львова зачистили. Я вам скажу честно, в отношении России ведется серьезная.
This is a serious war against Russia. So, Russians see Ukraine for what it is. It is they're right there. I mean, if they kick them out of eastern Ukraine, they're right. America, Europe, whatever, the capitalists are right at their border of Russia, not even the former USSR.
Война, подрывная деятельность.
A subversive activity. So they're talking about the West using these, and isn't that what I talk about all the time? About how we pay off thugs and robbers to take over countries for us so that we can loot them and turn them into slave countries like ours. I mean, we're pretty much a slave country. So, though Russia never attacked anyone first, the Russians are the most peace-loving people, the kindest. We're not aggressive nor resentful, are we? And I have to agree. I mean, they've given. I mean, they tried to become communists, which is a noble thing. No matter how much you've been propagandized not to believe it, communism is about caring about your fellow people. Says, with all respect, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. You fought there. I agree with you there. We shouldn't have meddled. Nor should have the Americans. If the Americans hadn't interfered, we wouldn't have either. They came up to our border. We didn't go up to theirs. See, that's what I was talking about. And I haven't watched this, by the way. I'm just watching it with you. But I had an inkling about what it would be about. The Afghans should sort it out themselves. Well, I don't think he even believes that, because we ended up with Taliban and Islamic fundamentalism. Now maybe if both sides didn't meddle, fundamental Islam would not be the predominant religion in the country. That's another one of those if-then kind of bowling. Nobody really knows, right? But you can use your brain to guess. Okay, he says, like the Ukrainians should sort it out amongst themselves. Well, I don't know why he says that, because in our book that's what they did, but that isn't really what they did, not according to what I've read. The United States very much, and Victoria Nuland very much backed these thugs to do. I mean, even if they sorted it out amongst themselves, it was like Nazi Germany, a bunch of really aggressive busybodies took over the country, and not. I mean, there were no elections until later, right? These people inserted themselves.
Что и жители Украины должны тоже разбираться между собой. Никто не мешает, но...
But how can you fire rockets at your own population? Yeah, I mean, the Western Ukraine has been on the attack all along, and they push and push and push, and then clearly the superior fighters are on the eastern side, so on the Russian side, because when they get pushed too hard, they'll really actually attack, and they just wipe out. You saw about that little clip or that little link I showed you, where they were saying that the Western Ukrainian fighters were getting slaughtered, the fascist Ukrainians. And it's true, every time that they piss off the Eastern Ukrainians, the Eastern Ukrainians just mop up. I mean, I dare say that Eastern Ukraine could take over Western Ukraine anytime it wants to, militarily. That they could just completely take back the whole country. And I don't think they'd get any complaints from the people, because I'm hearing through these weird little news sites, and not just weird little news sites, but kind of mainstream news sites. I also hear about these uprisings where the people just get fed up with these fascists. So, you know, and I'm always hoping that they're going to just knock them off. But in the end, you almost have to kill them all just to get rid of it. It's kind of like a cancer, you know.
Как можно стрелять установками залпового огня по своему якобы населению? Убивать детей.
Kill children, fire into residential areas. And yes, I follow the EU live map, which I'm sure you've seen me show for Syria. And the fascists are just firing into Eastern Ukraine. Just really random, really not. I mean, trying to. All these countries, all these thugs like Bashir al-Assad and the United States, they're all practicing World War II style warfare, which is to terrify and kill off a lot of the civilians. You know, the theory is that they back the people who are doing the fighting, and therefore you have to break them. And that's what the Eastern... Now, I don't hear very often about Eastern Ukraine firing into Western Ukraine. It's all... I mean, of course there's going to be... It's just like there's... Even where you got a whole bunch of fascists, there's going to be a good person in there, you know. There's always an exception to the rule. But generally speaking, the whole thing all over the world, our whole reality, there is good and evil. I mean, people like to say, oh, well, you can't really blame any one group. Well, I found that when you jump levels, you see the reality. So I can say that so-and-so who's a mass murderer is bad. And anybody who wants to say, well, you know, I suppose he had his reasons. Okay, well, you find out that, you know, there's good people and bad people, and of course there's people in between, and of course everybody makes mistakes, and and good people or bad people can do good things, and then they try and make out like they're good because they've done something good. It doesn't work that way. So what I'm saying is microcosms, like individuals and countries, are similar in that way, and you do get, or not necessarily countries, but groups. So like Alawites and the thugs who control Syria, and these Nazis who control Western Ukraine. They're bad people. They're bad people. And and they do these things, you know, like firing, like trying to I mean, it's just terrorism, just state terrorism and warfare. Says, do you think that the population of the eastern Ukraine, of the Donbass, of Lugansk, support volunteers and separatist fighters? They beg us, don't leave us, don't go away. And I'll tell you something, you're not going to like to hear it, but you'll find out the same thing about ISIS. You know, until things get really bad, the people there are like, oh, thank God you got us out from under those Shia militias, you know, that were terrorizing us. And then once the United States or Russia and Syria start bombing the shit out of the place, then of course they get a little tired of, because then they're losing that protection that they had. And of course they're anticipating the fact that they're going to have to pretend to hate ISIS, right? I mean, they're going to have to, because the Shia militias and the Iraqi army is going to, and in Syria, the Syrian Assad forces and Russian forces are going to come in. They're going to kill anybody who's supported ISIS, right? Or torture them or whatever, beat them and all kinds of stuff. So I assure you that they're already anticipating, as soon as the bombs start falling and the troops start moving in, they're anticipating having to switch allegiances and beg for mercy, right? Women cried and sobbed. We must protect ourselves.
We Russians are good at interpreting our wars as purely defensive. When that becomes difficult to argue, we claim that an act of aggression was a Soviet, not strictly Russian initiative. The air raids in Syria, of course, are the first properly Russian military operation for a long time. And I wonder how long it will take before new names will be added to this monument. The conflict with the Ukraine has dominated Russia's political life for a year and a half. Russia and the West accuse each other of interfering in the Ukraine. Over 1 million refugees have already crossed into Russia from the eastern Ukraine. In an office where Ukrainian refugees are helped with...
So I was right, huh? 1 million have crossed from west to east, and they're all crammed in there. I mean, if you look at the map, you'll see Russian Ukraine is very small. It's just a corner down there.
With registration in Russia, I look for someone prepared to tell me their story. Victoria Kolesnikova is a small entrepreneur from the Donbass. Despite the difficulties of life as a refugee, she's full of energy and has already found a job as a sales assistant. When she becomes a Russian citizen, her career chances should improve. I was invited to Victoria and Sergei Kolesnikov's new flat.
Чашки у нас разнобойные. Кто чего отдал? Называется.
Our cups are a mixture. We still have 2 from Ukraine.
Нет, у нас 2 из Украины, вот наши, которые.
We'll definitely stay in Russia.
Однозначно уже в России.
We won't return to the
В
Ukraine.
Украину мы не вернемся.
The economy is so destroyed that you can't even talk of business.
Потому что на самом деле там экономика настолько разрушена, что ни о каком ведении бизнеса сейчас невозможно вести речь.
There's not one bank, the post office doesn't work.
Там нет ни одного банка, не работают почты, просто их в априори.
We in the Donbass People's Republic are called separatists, terrorists. We had a referendum to join Russia for the Russian language.
Был референдум, у нас провели референдум за присоединение к России, за русский язык. Все люди шли как на праздник.
When I was recording this, I was also doing some stuff, so I'll jump ahead.
Понимание и решение, что мы трасса.
Понятно. Вот это украинские.
These are Ukrainian soldiers.
Военные. Вот они.
You see them? They had weapons. At first they surrounded the town, then they bombed it at night. There were no arms, no fighters, just pensioners and workers. We've been silent for too long. This will happen to all of us. Were you a separatist? Not a separatist or activist? Nothing? Thank you, President Poroshenko, for your anti-terror operation. I am a terrorist. I am a fighter. Whatever. When Ukrainians die, they're heroes. As for us, no one cares. So they're basically watching something about how the eastern Ukrainians are obviously being killed and oppressed. How do the Ukrainians justify this? They don't. They say terrorists, but there weren't any. I mean, there's never been like terrorist attacks inside Western Ukraine. There's people there who are angry and don't like the coup government, but there isn't like an ongoing terrorist organization working out of Western Ukraine doing things in Eastern Ukraine. Not that I've ever heard of any kind, and I think that we'd hear about it because our media would make a big deal out of anything like that. You know, that would look great for Western Ukraine. They would be like, you see, we have a reason to attack Eastern Ukraine, but I've never heard of anything like that. And the Ukrainians knew this? Of course, they'd surrounded the town. Locals even gave them food. We gave them borscht. Young lads. They were like our own children. Okay, so obviously I made a big mistake. I wasn't really thinking about how it would be covering up the writing, so I'm losing track of what they're talking about here. I'll let them get back.
An appointment at a local police station to become, no more, no less, citizens of Russia.
So this is about all the Ukrainians that can't take it anymore in eastern Ukraine because of all the shelling and the bombings and the ruining of the economy. Yeah, I mean, fascists ruin everything for everybody, and it's kind of like that in real life. I mean, I've been dealing with fascists all my life, even in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade in California. There was always a couple of fascists in the, you know, and they'd hit people. I got punched in the stomach. I got punched in the face and a bloody nose. And they were all the same. They were people in the classes that just were violent, and I never punched anybody. I never, unless I had to fight back sometimes. But that's what it was like growing up, right? Oh, I'll be waiting for you outside the gates after class, after school, you know, and why? Because you didn't want to do what they wanted you to do, things like that. And really it came down to that. I mean, in the world it comes down to that. You got these elitists, these rich people, and they all want everybody to do what they want them to do, and anytime anybody says, well, I don't want to do that, all of a sudden it's violence and hatred, and that's what's going on here in Ukraine. You got Victoria Nuland and the Clintonistas, the Obamas, OMBUS, and you know, Obama is just going along with it, but that's pretty bad too. So what they're doing is they're supporting people like Victoria Nuland, who are basically just neocons, and that makes them neocons too, and they're paying off people in these countries who want our support, and they want to take over the country and run it. You know, it's kind of funny. I mean, I was just this morning reading the Silmarillion, which is the kind of history of Middle Earth before the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and stuff. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And the beginning of it is they're basically the gods of Middle Earth and everything, and there's the God who creates all the lesser gods, and Melkor, which is like the guy who is like the biggest evil, like the devil. Sauron was just a lieutenant of his, and Sauron was all that was left in the Third Age or the Second Age or whatever. But anyway, that story was all about how Melkor and the people who he influenced, or the other gods he influenced, how they wanted to take over the world, how they wanted to heap glory upon themselves and things like that, and they wanted people to work for them and do their bidding and all that. So I mean, this is like a theme, right? You got the people who just live their lives and take everything day by day, moment to moment, like me. I just do. Ever since I stopped working, became retired now, or semi-retired, trying not to be completely retired, because I do like to work, and this is part of it. This is my one of my things I consider kind of work, but at the same time, my whole point of being semi-retired is to do work that I want to do, and do work for myself and the people who I love. I love all those people out there. So we live day by day, putting up with this pressure and this attacks and everything, and they live to try to dominate us. It's very animalistic, right? I mean, it's just like wolf packs and stuff. And when I hear people talk about, like when I hear a man say he's an alpha wolf, right there I'm like, okay, we got a problem. And some people I know who do that are some of my best friends and some of the most liberal and kind people I know. And yet they still can't seem to get away from this idea that you have to dominate. And dominating is the whole capitalist competition type thing. And so in all my life I've found serious problems with this whole competition thing, because it goes against, it's the opposite, right, of working together. You got competition, you got, I'm sorry, but I can't think of a lot of words, so I'll have to describe them sometimes, because I haven't got all day to do this. So you've got the world kind of split up into those two things, and these problems, whether it's problems with the people in the Middle East, who you call ISIS and the Taliban and stuff, I mean, they're just trying to solve things the way that we solve things, with brute force, right? They feel like they have absolutely no options, alternatives. So they try to be as brutal as they can, which isn't really that brutal compared to us. I mean, we're bombing people out of existence. They may set off a bomb once in a while, or... Okay, so anyway, so I'm saying that's a basic fact. I'm saying that's a basic thing that we're going to always operate out of, and that's that those people, as much as they would like to try and portray themselves as good, are actually, they're backward. They're animalistic. Their whole psyche is completely dominated by the idea that you have to be aggressive and win, instead of working together. Cooperation, that was what I was thinking of, the difference between competition and cooperation. And competition in itself isn't really all that much of a bad thing as long as it's just friendly competition. But the fact is competition has always been dominated by these people who use it to promote their own agenda. Okay, I think you know what I'm talking about by now. I mean, I'm trying very hard to describe this thing that's very murky and hard to understand. But I think you understand. I think you know what I'm talking about. I think, and a lot of you that are listening, if anybody's listening, I'm sure a lot of you haven't stopped to question competition and all the aggressive, I mean, I don't watch football. I used to play rugby. This was before I understood what it was all about. And all these violent sports, I don't have any hockey where people think it's fun when the fight starts. They don't think it's a good hockey game if there isn't some massive fist fight with blood on the ice. All that stuff. I'm not saying violence isn't necessary. People have to defend themselves. People have to keep bad people from running things. But at the same time, that whole attitude, so okay, we get that. Now let's go back to this, because this is a result of aggressive people versus people who at the very most are just defending themselves. And these are refugees from Donbass, and I forget what the name of it was, Smolensk or something like that.
Some of us have traveled the world and have seen more comfortable places than Central Russia. Some long to leave Putin's Russia for the West.
They didn't give us anything. Why? We just signed something. Did you get citizenship? Yes. Congratulations. Thank you.
But for others, the Russian passport means hope and the chance of happiness.
On 23rd of June, we became citizens of Ukraine. Oops, Russia. So these are people, I don't know if they're in Ukraine, but who are Ukrainians who are becoming Russian citizens.
Continue in the Ukraine. Conflicting accounts of what's happening there mean it's hard for me to form a clear picture of the conflict. I hear of someone who's recently returned from fighting in the Donbass. It feels unsafe to meet Bondadorovsky, since he no longer shares the government's version of the events in the Ukraine.
So I'm guessing that this guy was fighting on the Ukrainian east in western Ukraine for the fascists, and now he's not happy. It says, when it all started, I told myself I shouldn't go. But something in me was stronger. Okay, so I don't know, he may have been fighting for eastern or western Ukraine, I'm not sure. But I'm sure we'll figure it out from what he has to say here. So I went. I thought that we had really been attacked, that it was our front line. We were told that Russians were attacked and killed. So he must be fighting for eastern Ukraine, the Russian side. We went there to bring order. Guys come. God damn it. Here's another thing about human nature. Is 90% of the, at least if you have your life in control like I do, 90% of the things that happen to you are your own fault. So when I'm like recording this, I'm thinking, oh, I can do some other work. Well, guess what? I went right over the top of my own recording with these things, thinking, well, you'd be able to hear it, but I didn't realize it was all going to be in Russian.
Было такое вот в автобусе тягостно людей в черной форме. Вот. Но я по полиции снайпер. Я ведь бы не было внешней политики, уже давно бы всю Украину хватит. Были одни Россияне с самого начала.
So I'm sorry about that. We're going to have to miss bits, but I'm sure you'll still get the idea. So he says, it was mostly Russians at first. Now they're mainly local, just 20 or 30% Russians. The fighters want to advance, but the Kremlin doesn't let them. Without foreign policy, we would have taken the Ukraine long ago. So this confirms what I was saying, because this confirms what I was seeing on the ground. I mean, they just fucking kick ass, these guys, this eastern Ukraine. And the western Ukrainians, the Nazis, they just, I mean, these guys just wipe them out. And I know that it's got a lot to do with the type of weapons and all that kind of stuff, you know, technically. But but at the same time, a lot of it is like attitude, or whatever you want to call it, like knowing you're on the side of good, huh? I mean, the people who fight on the side of good always do a little bit better than what they're stuck with for weapons and tactics and all that kind of stuff. I mean, kind of makes up for that, for a lacking there. But now these guys, they also have the guns and the training and everything, and most of them were in the Ukrainian army, which was the Russian army up till 91, and then was a kind of Russian friendly army up till the coup. So the coup people have that to contend with. They want to take everything over, they want to take over the whole country, but they've got that problem. These guys are tough motherfuckers, like this guy right here. You wouldn't want to see him on the other side of a battlefield. I was a sniper. I looked through my scope and binoculars at them. We were told they had swastikas, black uniforms, that they shouted Sieg Heil. But they were the same as us, in the same green uniforms. I said to myself, it's all pointless. Are you going to kill people? I was happy that I had come to war. I was just sorry about one thing. I didn't see any enemy in them. They're closer. It landed. So they're actually hearing shelling as they're having their little conversation. That was nearby. There's another one. Many fighters say we don't give a damn about Putin. But this is Russian territory and we should get it back. We want this land inside the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Bondadorovsky's first-hand account of his war experiences may be too troubling for the man in the street. Many of my fellow Russians prefer a more simplistic view of the world and its politics.
Americans think we're the aggressor. And there are no Russian forces there? No. How can you be so sure? I watch television. They're killing peaceful people, the civilians. You're right, they are. The question is, who started it? Ukrainian nationalists, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, or whatever. They say they'll invade Moscow soon. What do you mean, invade Russia? Try it. They have nuclear weapons here. We're aggressors, but they think we're aggressors. Thank you for your opinion. Good luck.
A military show is one of the favorite pastimes for ordinary Russians. I test one of the latest rifles from the famous Kalashnikov company.
You hit it. I did. And this is what happens when you get the thugs. It forces everybody else to militarize, right? And usually they don't militarize fast enough. And fortunately, eastern Ukraine was already like full of soldiers, well-trained soldiers. And eastern Ukraine seems like not so much, huh? They had jets and stuff, but their what was left of their military after all the pro-Russian people went to the west was pretty small. So it seems like, and they seem like from this part of the thing that they're even like working on militarizing just that much more, because they have no choice. I mean, it's either that or just be run. Most of them would probably have to go into Russia, right?
Despite Western sanctions, Russia remains the second largest arms exporter in the world. It has the world's best and largest fleet of tanks and the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense equipment. Though second to American might on many counts, Russia is a formidable military force, and an extremely proud one. At the same time, it sees itself as a benign power that uses force only in defense. It will never admit to being an empire. Its innumerable nations.
And this isn't Russian television, by the way. This is Al Jazeera. And I don't think they really have a dog in this fight. So it's not like, well, it's not RT, so.
Are supposed to be equal and happy to be part of a great country. Someone I met here, Alan Hasir from Ossetia in the North Caucasus, expressed that view with astounding directness.
I think our army and our people have no equal. Look how the Anglo-Saxons behaved towards the world they conquered. Whereas in Russia, it followed into one entity, flowed. Not one ethnicity was wiped out. Instead, they got great opportunities. So that's an interesting point. There doesn't seem to be the racism in Russia, even though they're, the Soviet Union pretty much controlled That's probably why you don't see them except for Afghanistan. I think they went into Afghanistan kind of... I don't think it was part of the Russian Empire, but the Russian Empire, like, or the USSR, with all the stands, Kyrgyzstan, I don't know what they all are. You never did hear about the people uprising against them. So there must have been a certain amount of this must be true. Say they got great opportunities. So instead of bringing, like we do, or we did, and we still do in some places. I mean, the Filipino people are not happy. The Indonesian people are not happy. Most of South America, where the United States is still entrenched, is not happy. Any Middle Eastern countries, the people are not happy. See, and in Russian places, it seems like there was more. They did more to keep the people happy. What makes us number one in the that's what makes us number one in the modern world. So yeah, he's right. Some people are very happy, but of course that's not what it comes down to. Like in the United States, rich people are all happy. I hear people who don't understand that say, well, you know, he's such a happy guy, such a nice guy. Somebody who's ultra wealthy, right? Like my dad used to say it about Mr. Ali Reza, Muhammad Ali Reza, the owner of Rezayat, the company that was his cover in Saudi Arabia later on. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, he's got like, I mean, this guy had my dad purchase $2 billion in United States savings bonds. One transaction. $2 billion. So, I mean, yeah, he's happy. Of course he's happy. And he doesn't have to deal with anybody who makes him unhappy. If he finds somebody who makes him unhappy, he just says bye-bye. You know, and you can do that. You can't do that to your boss or to the people you have to deal with every day as a regular kind of person, you know, which is part of life. Not having to deal with assholes, that's part of what we're trying to get rid of. I mean, a lot of what we're doing, whether it's on national levels, the world, or has to do with us wanting to have a nicer experience at ground level, right? So we figure that if we can create a better world, a better place, where people aren't just scared, where they feel secure, financially secure, emotionally secure, then when we step out our doors every day, we don't have to deal with these people who are all pissed off all the time. Because isn't that really because directly it doesn't always affect you, right? Okay, how much the United States hates the North Koreans, or the North Korea hates the United States, but when you step outside your door, you go to the store and what have you, and you have to deal with all these angry people, well, those people are angry. If you really wanted to get to know them and find out what it was and trace their anger, where the aggravation is coming from, you'd find out that it's coming from a system that doesn't care about all the little aggravations it creates. So, I mean, it's all related, right? I'm right. I'm sure I'm right. Some people might not agree, and some people might want to lay the blame all on the people who are aggravated and angry and complaining, but I find that extremely unlikely.
Such exaggerated praise for our multi-ethnic state doesn't tell the whole story. In the next film of the series, will deal with the culture of overlooking the darker pages of our history. As for the future, it seems likely that the next generation will share the uncritically proud view of their homeland that prevails today.
Okay, so, I mean, this has everything to do with not becoming your enemy, right? I mean, when we talk about, even though it's not a fair comparison because we're the aggressors and the ones who cause it, but when we talk about not letting terrorists destroy our way of life, well, we're talking about the same thing, right? So we become like terrorists and we become like fascists. Now, I've tried to explain to you that there's a dichotomy going on here, and you've got most of the people we call terrorists aren't really any more terrorists than we are. I mean, I think we bombed 130 mosques in Syria over the last year or so. Well, I mean, how different is that from ISIS bombing 2 or 3 mosques in a year with a car bomb and sacrificing their lives to do it? Suicide bombers. By the way, this latest bombing in England of the subway, the fact that it had a timer on it and everything, I'm just thinking false flag, but that's just a possibility. And we might want to keep it in mind. The fact that it didn't even really go off. Nobody was killed, of course. But anyway, so I think it's important that everybody study warfare and terrorism and conflict in detail and have a really good understanding of it, because at some point people are going to have to make the decisions on how to deal with it, and because we obviously can't trust our leaders to do the right thing, right? So we need to be well educated, well informed. We need to create a system that brings us the facts, not the constant propaganda bullshit. And one of these days we'll get direct representation, whether it's something like similar to what we have, except for our representatives actually do what we want or not, or if we end up with just where we vote on it. Because ultimately I think the people en masse, the masses, are smarter, or at least less corrupt, and are kinder and gentler and everything else, ultimately, at least when they're well educated, when they have the facts. I mean, a lot of people are Nazis because they don't know what they're talking about, right? I mean, they don't have a clue. They're clueless. So they just go off what they do know. And that is to protect their little clique. You know? To protect their small group of white people or whatever. That's what creates the racism and the nationalists, white nationalists, and all that stuff. Alright, so you can go to my group, Ukraine, America's Capitalist Shame, and you can find link after link after link I say here, as the son of a neocon who used to travel around the world participating in operations, I can tell you the opposite is true. They actually want cheap labor. Anyone who can be subjugated to do the work, yes, they want to get rid of any resistance, but anyone they can turn into labor force, they will actually put a carrot in front of. If that doesn't work, a whip. If that doesn't work, a gun. And then I have one of my favorite memes. Yeah, if you could just come to the dark side, that'd be great. Yeah, remember that movie, The Office? It's kind of a joke on that movie. So there's I mean, I have like everything on here. You can just go look. So
I represented New York, and I represented New York on 9/11. When we were attacked, where were we attacked? We were attacked in downtown Manhattan, where Wall Street is. I did spend a whole lot of time and effort helping them rebuild. That was good for New York, it was good for the economy, and it was a way to rebuke the terrorists who had attacked our country.
9/11 was bad.